So welcome to this Good Bloke Not Woke podcast. This time I'm going to be interviewing Darren Harris. Now, some of you may have never heard of Darren, but wait till you hear his resume. It's amazing. So he was born in New Guinea and he grew up in Wodonga. And his dad was an absolute passionate footy man, loved his footy, and it rubbed off on his son. So he played his footy locally in Wodonga, and as he played senior footy, he played in a premiership for the Wodonga Bulldogs in the Ovens and Murray League when he was just 19 in 1987. He played in two premierships for Golden Square in the Bendigo Football League when he was studying at university. Went back and played another season at Wodonga before moving across to WA in 1992 to play for West Perth under Jeff Geishan, who I worked with at Richmond Footy Club. In 1995, he became team captain at West Perth. He won the Breckler Medal, which is their best and fairest, and he captained the team in a Simpson Medal winning, which is best on ground performance, to the in the premiership, their first premierships since 1975. He played in the West Australian state team in 1996, which is amazing, and was ultimately named in the West Perth Team of the Decade for that decade. So pretty incredible performance. Then he went on to be playing coach. He went back to Wodonga, where he coached Wodonga Raiders. So it's the arch enemy of his former club, the Bulldogs. And he led the club to its first and only premiership, which is pretty incredible. After 3 years, he took on a development role with the ACT New South Wales Rams in the TAC Cup. In 2002, he returned to West Perth and took the Falcons to consecutive grand finals, winning the second in 2003. That's the Falcons, of course, being West Perth Footy Club. He then spent 2 years as an assistant coach of West Coast Eagles before moving to Carlton as a development manager and also partly as Northern Bullants coach in the VFL. So then he returned to WA at the end of the 2012 season and worked with leadership firm Leading Teams, and anybody who's close to the AFL will have heard about Leading Teams. He also coached the West Australian state team without even being a coach in the league in 2015 and 16. In 2017, he took up the senior coaching role at Claremont Footy Club, and he took them to the 2020 grand final, which they lost, and was promptly sacked. So a year later, he returned to coaching West Perth, and in 22 and 23, he took them to the grand final. In 23, they won the premiership. So it's just last year, right? So he's had a rich journey of helping many people and being helped by many people. And I really can't wait to talk to him. And what connected me to him was I noticed on LinkedIn, I'd never heard of Darren Harris, but the West Perth Football Club had named their under-15s academy after him. And I thought, wow, who's this guy? He must be pretty special. So I reached out to him and said, would you like to come and talk about healthy masculinity and the role of football in that? So he's with us today. Welcome to another episode of the Good Bloke Not Woke podcast, where we discover and talk about healthy masculinity from multiple different perspectives. And I'm so excited that Darren's with us today because, Darren, you've had a huge impact in footy in WA. You've been in it for a very, very long time. I mean, reading your LinkedIn profile is amazing. And I noticed that you're very heavily connected to Claremont Footy Club, and I've had some good friends play there, John and Ian being one of them. And how's it all going?
Yeah, going really well, thanks, mate. Footy's been really good to me. I was a country Victorian boy. So my dad actually was teaching in New Guinea, and I was born in New Guinea, and then we ended up in Wodonga, and Wodonga in country Victoria was just this great little community. It's not so little now, Albury, Wodonga. I think it's a pretty big centre now. But when we got there it was about 73, there's like 15,000 people in Wodonga. And so it had this real community feel. So I grew up in that area and just was really lucky that you had this independence as a kid. So,
Yeah,
you
wow.
know, I was really lucky that my dad was a school teacher there, and I could ride my bike to the basketball stadium, to the footy club, to the tennis courts, to the local pool down the creek. So I had this wonderful childhood, but I just loved footy probably out the back of my old man, loving the game. And so my journey in footy ended up bringing me to WA as a young fella at about 22 years of age, and I keep coming back. So I've had 3 kids in 3 states with footy. Thank my lovely wife Gail for that. But
Wow.
I've sort of came over and played for 5 years. Went back to Wodonga and coached. Came back and coached West Perth. Then ended up in the AFL system and ended up back in Melbourne. Then back to West Perth again. Coach Claremont in between that. So yeah, I've been coaching for about 26 years, um, and a lot of those years have been in WA, which has been fantastic, mate.
Wow, wonderful. It's so interesting, you know. It's like you talk about Wodonga. I just got married recently, and I got married up in the mountains of Utah. My wife is American. We were married at 10,000 feet, and I realized I needed a best man, and I contacted a really good mate of mine who I studied phys ed with, and he was a footballer. He played, I don't know, 20 or 30 games in the VFL, partly with North Melbourne and with St Kilda. And in on the 13th of December 1983, we both went to the US, and he never came back.
Yeah,
And he lives in Bellingham. And anyway, so we flew him into Salt Lake City so he could be there for my wedding and be my best man. He's a great bloke, but he's a North Albury boy.
right.
He
Yeah,
started his footy out at North Albury, and
yeah,
yeah, but then other blokes who you probably came across, Mark Turner and his wife Bernadette, they're all, you know, well, Mark Turner's not a Wodonga boy, but he went back there with Bernadette
yeah,
after they finished college. And yeah, so it's a great part of the world. That part of the world's produced some incredible athletes from Wodonga right up through Wagga, and
yeah.
amazing. So
Yeah, I lived in Wagga for a couple of years too, working for the AFL
yeah.
while I was over there. So had one of our children in New South Wales, one in Victoria, and one in WA.
Oh, there you go. So what happens with state of origin?
Yeah, look, I still see myself as a Victorian. It's interesting. I think when you grow up as a country Victorian, it's sort of in your blood. I had a funny story. I've coached WA for a couple of years, the state team, and I captained WA. But when I
Wow.
captained WA, I remember driving in my car one day and turned the radio on, and they haven't talkback radio, and it was Brad Hardy going, "How can you make a Victorian the captain of the WA team?" And I sort of was going, "Yeah, that's probably fair enough too," because I still probably saw myself as a Victorian.
Oh, well, Brad Hardy just shooting his mouth off when he's miles and miles away, you know. He's married to one of my best friends, so
He's been good for footy.
yeah, yes, absolutely. Well, mate, it's a bit like there's a fellow played who I studied phys ed with. His name was Peter Russo.
Yep,
Played at Hawthorn, and I don't know how many games Pete played. Probably played nearly 200.
yep.
And he, after his very first game, you remember Sun Score? Remember in the Herald Sun, or it used to just be
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
back in those days, and
yep,
they'd rate the players out of 10. And I
yeah.
walked in on Monday morning. I walked past him. I said, "Oh, only 4 Sun Score points." And he looked at me and he said, "4 more than you'll ever get."
There- there's
so,
there- there's some
so
feedback, John.
exactly. So we can, and I just thought that was one of the best comebacks of all time. But we can hang shit on Brad Hardy, but he's got a Brownlow medal, mate. Nobody can take that off him.
Absolutely.
So mate, it's so you went across there to play footy originally,
Yeah, so I was in Wodonga and I was playing under a bloke by the name of Jeff Geeshan, who ended up at Richmond. And
I work with the Geesh at Richmond.
yeah, yeah. So he came to Wodonga and coached the Wodonga Footy Club in 1986. So I actually played a game of footy with Geesh.
Right.
So,
Wow.
in 1986, and then in 1987, he became the full-time coach and we won a premiership. And I went away to uni and came back and played in 1991 for Wodonga. 1991. And I couldn't get a teaching job in Victoria at the time. It was the Kennett government. A lot of teachers were being laid off, and the teachers that were being laid off did the relief teaching. So I was working some night shift in in a a factory, trying to play footy, living back at home, and I lost my way a bit that year.
Right.
Definitely, if I look back, it was a time where I wasn't feeling great about myself because I didn't have this real purpose, etc. Living at home again after having all this independence. And my dad rang Jeff Geishan when he got the job at West Perth and said, could Darren come with you? And Geish was good enough to say, yeah, Darren, come over and have a crack. And so I put a backpack on and moved to WA and had a real crack at it and ended up becoming captain of the footy club. So I
Wow.
owe so much to the West Perth Footy Club.
Wow.
When I got over there was a couple of elders there. Craig Nelson was the captain and the ruckman at the time, and the late Wayne Damon, who unfortunately lost his life at work one day, was only a young man with a family. But those two men sort of looked after me, and I could say to them, I could be quite vulnerable with them because I knew
Yeah.
that they cared about me and said, look, I'm really struggling. Like I feel like people don't like me. I'm really, I'm in my own head a lot. And these two men really helped me.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so on the back of that, I went and got some support and got a help, went and saw a psychologist for a while. And she really got me changing my self-talk and thinking about my story and what had happened to me. And through these couple of men at the footy club, and Geish was one of those, all of a sudden I started to believe in myself, and from there ended up the captain of the footy club.
Wow.
So you'd imagine that 5-year period at West Perth as a player, and we ended up winning the premiership in '95, of which I was captain, just changed a lot of the way I believed in myself. So yeah, I'll always be indebted. That's why I want to keep going back and giving back to the West Perth Footy Club because they just gave so much to me, mate.
Gee, that's cool. I mean, I've never ever had a connection to West Perth Footy Club, so that's so beautiful to hear that story. What's their what's their mascot?
Oh, it's a Falcon.
Uh-huh. The
Used
Falcons.
to be the
Okay.
Cardinals, and then they
Right.
changed from the Cardinals to the Falcons.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay. And there you go. That's interesting. I never ever knew that. Because I knew, like about East Perth, and I think Ronnie Alexander was East Perth, wasn't he?
yeah, yeah.
And Ronnie was at
And he's
college
from
with
Anna.
us. He was, that's right, he's from Mantle, that's right. And he was, and I've got a lot of friends over there. I mean, footy, it's really interesting. I reckon the Waffle was always a little bit closer to the community than the VFL was. And
Yeah,
so,
it's really tribal, and it still is. Like
yeah,
you're so connected to a club. Still, anyone who's a Perth person, you go, who do you barrack for? They have a Waffle club. And when it gets to finals, and a lot of the old supporters come out of the woodwork, I couldn't believe it in '93 under Geesh. We played Claremont in a grand final, and so being a country Victorian, turn up to Subiaco Oval this day, and it's a packed house, and we're doing the warm up, and I remember running towards the 3-tier stand, and it was that loud, it scared me. I was
yeah,
genuinely scared by the noise. And it was like, wow, but they just came out of everywhere for the grand final. And 95 was the same. It was just a packed house. It was so good
yeah,
to be
wow.
involved in.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's one of the interesting things about footy and like the MCG. I took my wife to her first ever AFL game earlier this year. We went and saw Collingwood Carlton at the MCG, and there was 88,000 people there. And she just couldn't believe it. She just couldn't get over the fact that on a Friday night, 88,000 people would be out there to watch the footy,
Yeah,
and I was telling you that when I was in conditioning roles in the footy, you're often out on the ground during the game, and the players can't hear each other out in the middle of the
yeah,
MCG.
yeah,
Coach can say, "Why don't you talk?" Well, we can't hear him, boss. It's
yeah,
like It is so loud out there. It's incredible.
It's I was so fortunate to spend 4 years in footy in Melbourne. So when I worked for Carlton, so
Uh-huh.
turn up and I'd worked for the Eagles for 3 years and ended up at Carlton, and then we played Richmond on a Thursday night, first game of the year, and sort of went to work in the morning, worked throughout the day, jumped in my car, had a car park at the MCG, drove in underneath the MCG, walked out on the oval, having a bit of a kick before the game, and crowd starts to come in, and all of a sudden there's 90,000 people at the G,
Yeah.
and it's a Thursday night, first game, and I'm going, geez, I'm getting paid to do this. This is pretty special. But yeah, the atmosphere was amazing. I was really fortunate to work in footy in Melbourne for those 4 years.
Yeah, well, my wife said to me, how can these people, like Friday night, 88,000 people? And I just said, well, darling, because there's things that are important and then there's things that are really important.
Here's your education.
That's right. So mate, what years were you at Carlton?
I moved over there in 2000, so I was 2009, 10, 11, and 12 were my years at Carlton.
Right, gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Wow. Was Justin Cordy conditioning coach
Yeah, he
there?
was. Yep,
Yeah,
yeah,
gotcha. Yeah.
yeah. He was a good man. We did a really interesting. We went to Qatar for a couple of weeks, and he orchestrated all of that. And we went, and you had half the team slept at altitude, half the team didn't. And then we took all this information about what it was like to train in the heat over there, and half the group stayed at home. So you had all these different pieces of data, and it was I don't quote me exactly on the data, but it was like if you trained at heat, your improvement in fitness went up quite significantly than the group that didn't train at heat. Then the team that the group that slept at altitude were able to hold on to their fitness longer when they got back than the team that didn't sleep at
Right.
altitude.
That's
So there was this great data that came out of the back of that. But
Yeah,
that
it's
was
so
Justin
interesting.
Cordy.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he when he was first starting out, it was in '99, and he rang us at Richmond and said, "Look, I really want to be a conditioning coach. Can I come and observe what you guys do?" And we said, "Yeah, come in as much as you want." And we included him in it and got him to give us his
Mm.
viewpoints, and yeah, you could sort of see back then that he had a bit of a future. So that was pretty cool. I'm glad he got all those roles. And even when he went to the Australian cricket team, I remember Glenn McGrath telling me, he said, I really like him. He said, because he didn't tell me what to do. He asked me what I was doing and if it was working for me. And I told him what I was doing and said it was working for me. He said, good, keep doing it. He left me alone.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like, yeah, so there's some good humility, mate. So obviously through all that year, you've led a lot of young men and you've had a lot of influence on people's lives. And as you know, this podcast is about exploring healthy masculinity. And as I said earlier, I have a lot of faith in footy clubs if they're run well to be able to make a massive contribution to boys becoming good young men. And of course, now it's relevant to say helping young girls to become good, strong young women as well.
yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you'd like to share some of your perspectives of where you got your learning, some of your approaches. You might have some really cool stories about guys who were off the rails and came back on the rails. It's because like a
Yeah,
lot of people don't know, for example, the role that Mark Williams played in helping Dustin Martin get stable in his life.
yeah,
And then look what happened.
yeah. Yeah, I've got a couple of what comes to mind as you're speaking is I think I was really lucky as a kid, like I've sort of mentioned about my father. So he loved footy, and so he
Yeah.
used to do things with me in the backyard, like he'd set up a little oval on the grass in the backyard, and he'd cut the oranges, and we'd play this game and commentate, and I'd be Collingwood, and I'd be Stan Magro having a bounce down the wing and all this sort of stuff, and but it was just always fun. And whenever he
Yeah.
took me to a game, and I've used the story about juicy fruit a fair bit with my teams over the journey, but he used to stop, pick up a can of Coke and a juicy fruit, and he'd give me a juicy fruit. And that was part of the ritual of going to junior footy, the Wodonga sub midgets. But
Hmm.
all he ever said to me, and he was a coach, but he never coached me, he said, if you don't enjoy it, you don't have to do it.
Yeah.
And so I just had this absolute love of the game. But my first coach, my dad was a single father for a little while and was struggling a little bit with me and my sister. And so my coach lived around the corner. His name was Bert Cadman, who's passed away now, and so is my father. But these men, so Bert Cadman, I turn up at training, and because we don't have a lot of money at that stage, I turn up in an old pair of sneakers that I had, running shoes. I didn't have any boots. Bert Cadman went down and bought me a pair of footy boots.
Wow.
So you imagine your first coach, he goes and buys you a pair of footy boots. So he's obviously got the care factor going on, and that's never left me. And so I
Yeah.
love Bert Cadman. And we were the Purples, and we used to have pie nights at his place, and he used to do all these things that built connection and relationships and us loving being around each other. And he was also a Wodonga Football Club committeeman. So when I come through the Purples and work my way all through the footy and end up playing in a premiership as a 19-year-old for Wodonga, he's there having a beer with me that night. So it was
Wow.
a really nice little journey. But he used to drop me home because Dad would have to look after my sister and couldn't pick me up from footy training and those sort of things. Um, so then if I go through, I had all these different men, and I gravitated to the ones that really cared about you and did those things. So, I watched my dad care for people. I watched Bert Cadman do that for me. And then as I went through, I kept gravitating towards those type of people. And I had a vice principal who became a principal called Bill Proud, and he was really great mates with my dad, and he was a local cricket legend,
Hmm.
but just a real pillar of the community. So I
Yeah.
remember one day getting the monitor comes to the classroom and knocks on the door and, oh, can I please have Darren Harris? And I'm sitting in the year 6 class, and I get taken up to the principal's office, and it's Mr. Proud's office. And because I've got a relationship with him and he's watched me grow up as a kid, he sits me in the office and he goes, now, did you know that you're upsetting your teacher at the moment? And I went, no. And he, oh, not really. And he goes, well, she's coming to school and she's going home with some anxiety and, not feeling great because of your behaviour in the classroom. And I was a full-on kid, year 6, going flat out with my mates. But I also he knew how to get to me. So I
Yeah.
went back into that classroom and went, geez, I don't want to upset this lady. And it just shifted me because he had the relationship, but he taught me a lesson around you got to think about other people and what your behaviour is like. So I had all these little lessons that really sit with me,
Yeah.
John,
Wow.
and have just great mentors that have showed me how to treat people. And there's hundreds of stories of things that I gravitated towards like that. But then when I started teaching in WA, I had a teacher by the name of Jan Sony, and she was a bit older than me and been teaching for a long time, but she must have liked something about me. And she grabbed me one day and said, "Look, I need to help you with some of your organisation, etc. But have you got children?" She knew I didn't have children. And I said, "No, I don't have children." She goes, "Well, what's going to happen when you're teaching is you're going to have people come in and say, well, you don't have children. Don't tell my child what to do,' and they'll challenge you." She said, "So what I want you to do is think about that classroom you've got. Any of those children, if they were your son or daughter, how would you treat them?" And it sort of got me thinking. I said, all right. So got my dad's example. I sort of know what I stand for. But that was some of the greatest bit of advice I've ever been given, because all of a sudden I was able to be consistent with behavior. If someone was doing something that I thought, what would I tell my son or my daughter? I'd say, no, come on, don't swear, or whatever it was. And it allowed me to treat everyone with that respect and that care. And
Yeah.
so that carried over into my footy. Like I, as a coach, as you would know, John, you're never going to keep everyone happy.
Mm.
There's players that I really challenge, but I challenged them to be better on the basis of that. If that was my son, what would I be saying to them? And
Yeah.
again, it's just given me this consistency through my life of, it doesn't mean that I haven't improved and my values haven't become stronger and I've learnt and I'm imperfect and all those things, but it's given me this real true north, I reckon,
Yeah.
on what my expectations are. So I guess, Herbie Harris, Bert Cadman, the Jeff Geeshans, the Bill Prouds, the Jan Sonis had big impacts on me and the way I thought about things and how I treated people.
Yeah.
It was
So
all on the back of
interesting.
the relationship, John.
Yeah, so cool, mate. And it's really interesting how that they often just ask you a question to get you to consider something. And Greg Chappell was saying the same thing the other day when he was at school. There was this teacher there and a coach, and he said just at the right time he would just come up and just ask me a question and just leave me with it. And he goes, man, those moments where quiet words from people with a really good intention.
Yeah,
You don't have to yell at people. You don't have to berate them. You don't have to make them wrong. You don't have to humiliate them. You just need to help them trim their sails a little bit.
yeah, yeah. No, look, you always, as you become older, you become so grateful for those things, and all of them. When I think about all of them, they all cared about me.
Yeah,
They all cared enough about me to challenge me or to make me better by having a conversation with me. Bobby
yeah,
Craig was another one at the Wodonga Footy Club. I remember it was, I was a young, I'm probably only 17 or 18. And I'm trying to get into the senior side in 86. And, I've sort of probably been one of the better players all the way through. And I want to play. And I remember sitting at the bar. He wouldn't even remember this, but I remember sitting at the bar, having a 7 ounce beer at the bar, sitting next to Bob Craig. And I said something about one of the players that was getting the game. And he turned to me and he goes, mate, you don't worry about that. You worry about yourself, mate. And he really challenged me around, you've got to get your backyard right, mate. You're not playing seniors because you're not getting your backyard right. And he really
mm,
challenged me about being a better person. And all of a sudden I thought, why am I talking about one of my mates getting a game? That's not in my, and it was a really young man lesson of, yeah, I probably stepped out of line there. And he was this bloke who was probably 15 years older than me, just going whack. And it
yeah.
was exactly what I needed at the time.
Well, I call it those little moments of humiliation that wake you up a bit.
Mm,
And
yeah.
but we've got to have that sting. And I'm wondering, and this is just I'm following what I'm feeling here with the conversation. I was talking to a friend this morning in the States, and she's got two daughters who are in their late teens, early 20s. And she's lamenting about how they just got, one of them especially, just got no resilience, can't handle anything hard at all. And it appears that that may be something of this generation that's coming through. And it's not because they're bad, but life, when societies are wealthy, life's a bit easier. Kids don't have to scrap for stuff like they used to. And I'm wondering how you're finding it with the young people coming through now. I mean, obviously you're probably more exposed to the boys than the girls, but how are you finding them in terms of their I suppose their internal strength and their ability to cope with adversity and take on the hard stuff? And yeah,
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question and gets talked about a lot with the generations. Probably as you become an older generation, you may be looking back and you got your own experience. Like it was a pretty simple life for me in Wodonga and growing up, and you were out in the street. I have an analogy that the game's won and lost in the street, which is about the midfield, but it's reflective of living in Athens Street in Wodonga. You could sit in your front yard or your backyard, but to be a part of the community and part of the game, you had to get out on the street.
yeah,
You
yeah,
had to stub your toe, and you had the bigger boys up the street, bashing you and playing these games in the street, and that's where you learnt a lot of your resilience and your moral code and how to treat people and all that, because that's all we did.
yeah,
Whereas there's definitely a shift in the amount of time we spend with people in that like when the light goes out, you got to come in, Darren.
Yeah.
When the light goes out in the street, that's time to come in, and pretty much, it's free range. So, there's definitely a safety factor and all that goes on, no doubt. But I guess what I'm seeing is that there's a real maturity in a lot of these young people that are coming through, which I really admire. And once they become part of a community or a team, um, their resilience is strong because they've got that support around them.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a few things going on in my head there that I've sort of lost my way a
That's
little
all
bit
right.
with. But when I think about this resilience piece, it's it's probably the fact that everything happens really quickly these days, I believe, like whether it's a phone or a message and so what happens is there's probably a little bit more impatience going on of I want to get there, but I think parents want their kids to get there and be successful, and there's this pressure that builds that probably has an effect on the resilience piece as well as why aren't I there yet? Well, you need 10,000 hours of work to be able to be better at something. And so unless you put in the work and the time, you're probably not going to get there. So I think we've created a fair bit of it,
Yeah.
and the pressure that goes with that, which affects the resilience. But when you're in this real safe, supportive environment, and we're talking footy clubs here or church group, whatever it is, a really good school that's got a good leader. When you're in that environment, I think your resilience is the people around you that help you be
Mm-hmm.
resilient in that environment.
Yeah.
And that's where the work I do these days is I'm trying to use all those Bert Cadman experiences and whatever to make that environment where you can be resilient in it and you want to be there because it makes you feel better about yourself. You
Yeah.
want to keep coming back to that environment. So I
Yeah.
think
Sure.
we have a responsibility with our history and our lessons learned to try to create those environments. There's a lot to that question, mate. I could go on for a while because I'll often talk about this resilience piece too of, players these days have a manager, parents, then they might have three different coaches because they might have a school coach that's, needs you 9 games a year, and then you got your state coach, and then you got all these people, and they all want the best players or the best teams. So all of a sudden, what are you listening to? So if if
Yeah.
if I've got the right parents that are going, no, go and listen to your coach, then that player has got a massive chance of succeeding.
Yeah.
But as soon
Yeah.
as there's that soft ear, it takes like, oh, now I can choose. I'm going to listen to that one, or I'm going to listen to that one. It can become confusing to do the work. Like at the end of the
Yeah.
day, doing the work, it takes you away from that if you listen to too much of the opinions going on out here.
Yeah. So true. It's like I went to school at Morris Brothers in Melbourne. I did my last 3 years at Marcelin College, which is Luke Shuey's school. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I go back there and talk to the year 11 and 12 boys about mental health most years. And I used to always ask the question. So we're going back into the late 90s, and I'd ask the question, put your hand up if you know what you want to do when you leave school. And I'd always get 2 or 3 or 4 hands go up, and someone would say, I want to be a doctor, or I want to be an engineer. And then one year I went out there and I asked the question, and half the hands went up. I went, Jesus, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And then I twigged and I said, put your hand down if it's professional athlete. And all those hands dropped. When I went to school, the only athletes that made any money were golfers and boxers. Tennis players weren't even, they were just struggling.
Yeah.
But now all of a sudden you've got this wealth of things that people can do. Even somebody who's a cricketer who may never play Test cricket for Australia can still become a multi-millionaire playing Indian Premier League. And so you've got all these kids with stars in their eyes and wealth and their parents with, the thoughts of their kids being famous and all those sorts of things. And so there's a lot to deal with there, you know.
Mm.
The other side of it, from a physical perspective, I was talking to Paul Roos about it. And Roosie said to me, Johnny, when we were kids, we would get home from school, drop our bags, and straight down the park to kick the footy. And
Yeah.
he said if there was a kid in the neighbourhood who got a new footy, he was your new best friend. And we would kick the footy till it was too dark. Then we would go and find a street light and keep going under the street light. And he said we'd be jumping on each other and bashing each other and tackling each other
Yeah.
and body slamming. And he said it hardened our bodies up.
Mm.
He said now when the kids come into the system, they haven't got that. And he said it takes us 3 years to get their bodies ready to
Yeah.
play senior footy.
Yeah, no, it's so true.
Mm.
You know, while I was coaching at AFL and waffle level, I still coached my son's team for 7 years. So,
Yeah.
you know, you're sort of at an elite level, and then you're coaching these kids. And a lot of the time, I would give 6 kids. I'd break them into groups of 6 and go, here's 4 markers, 2 markers each end. Go and make your goals, and go and play a game of footy 3v3, and off you go. And I just
Yeah.
walk around and make sure it's safe. But that's all we ever did at
Yeah.
school, in the park. We just played games. So what it taught you was you had to umpire it yourself. So conflict resolution. You had
Mm-hmm.
all these opportunities to play the game. You know, you'd change the teams because one team would be winning. All these things you did that taught you your values was
Mm.
all done in the street or in
Yeah.
the schoolyard.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm a big believer in that. I often say now that the mind follows the body. So if you get yourself really, really fit and you're committed to that, how much better you feel about yourself, how much
Yeah.
clearer you are, how better you perform
Yeah.
because you've done the work.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. It is so true. It was interesting. Chris Jones, who was one of my most significant mentors, Jonesy taught me so much. He was an Englishman who'd spent 10 years at Oregon in physical education, studying, lecturing. He was a good competitive athlete himself. He was a very good rugby union player and basketballer. And then later, he was a good runner. And he came to Australia to take over as health director of a health club or a couple of different health clubs. And I worked at those health clubs, and I was lucky enough to work under him. And he really took me under his wing, and he taught me so much stuff. And we catch up from time to time. And anyway, one of our last catch ups, he was telling me about a project that he took on where he helped Melbourne Storm put together their youth development program. And he said it got to the point where in 2017, I think 76% of Melbourne Storm's list came from the youth development program. The average for the NRL was 3%.
Yeah.
And I said, give us an example of what the sort of stuff you did. And he said, well, Johnny, it was a big program. There's a lot to it. He said, but here's an example. Let's just say summer training, the boys come down and they've got to do a running session that involves 3100s. So, well, they don't just go out and do 3100s. They have to sit down in the rooms beforehand and write an intention. How is this training session going to make me a better human being? And he said, we don't accept bullshit responses. We want real stuff. So
Yeah.
these guys go out there with an intention to not just train hard, but to become a better human being through doing that training session. And I just thought, wow, that's just taken it to a whole new level, you know?
Yeah. Again, my time at Carlton, we had a little bit of a relationship with the Storm. And so in my time, one of the things that I really remember as being an incredible idea was that, you know, a lot of Islanders playing, you know, and but all their development players had to have a job. So they'd work, and before and when they'd finished work, then they'd come in from their work and have to train, but they have to be on the shovel. They had to do this hard work. And
Yeah,
what had ended up happening, because their program was so full, that they'd end up with the ones that were really committed And so when you talk about 76% or, they'd have to work so hard to earn the stripes to be there.
Yeah.
So when you talk about resilience and you think about the Storm, what an amazing program and how well they've been led.
Oh man. And I was talking to somebody recently who said they would love to get me to come and do some work in rugby league because it is struggling. And one of the challenges is that beer drinking culture. And the problem is not the players, it's the blokes up high up in the club who like the beer drinking culture. They don't want to change it. And
Mm.
the Danish have got a great saying that the Greeks stole, which is that a fish stinks from the head down. And if you haven't got the right people at the top of the club, then the rest of the club's got no hope.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the things when Kennett went into Hawthorn. He went in there and he just, he ruled with an iron fist. And he just said, mate, this is how we're doing it. And if you don't like it, see you later.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was, it's that's required sometimes, that strong leadership.
Yeah.
So what do you reckon now? I mean, see, we were talking earlier before the podcast. I mean, I have huge faith in local footy, and cricket, by the way, and soccer, and basketball, and all those sports. There's something about footy clubs, though. There's a social element. Maybe it's because of the length of the game and the size of the field. But I really don't know what it is. But where local footy clubs have got an opportunity to pick up the stragglers out on the fringe, the kids who can't get to a game because it's a single parent family or there's problems in the home or whatever. And same as that, the older people, the retired people are sitting at home, they're perhaps a bit bored, they're a bit disconnected, but they love footy, they love being around people. What do you feel about that? And how can we make that go a bit better than it is?
I've had a couple of people mention to me that are, elite coaches over the last few years that see football clubs as modern day churches.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
it's not a bad analogy, like these are people that have been around a long time, and they go, they're the modern day churches. So when you think about the lifeblood of a community, they're your sporting clubs, whatever they are, but really good clubs bring people in and they make people feel like they belong. And so again, all the clubs I've been at have done that and done it really well. And so it caters for every individual. So, I might be the goal umpire at junior footy, but my purpose and what I do there, I know that that's important, or I'm the team manager, or but when you get to a waffle club and it's a pretty big organisation. In country Victoria, you always was combined with netball, and that was a
Yeah.
great community because you had your whole community there, working together. So now in waffle footy, there's the women's program, and all of a sudden we've got this much more inclusive environment happening, and that's been great for the footy clubs as well. But all of a sudden, you got all these people that have roles and jobs. Look, I've got some great stories, and I'm sure Joe Hinder won't mind me. I use this one a fair bit, but when I think about the West Perth Footy Club, I go back to coach there, and there's so many things that happen that end up getting someone where they get to, but then your environment is the one that has the biggest impact. So Joe Hinder's a young fella. He's struggling a little bit. He's not really got a home of residence. He's sort of moving around, and people are looking after him because he's such a wonderful kid. And he had this really good friend who said, "Look, I'm going to take you to the West Perth Footy Club, and we'll go and try out there." And his friend couldn't get him to get out of the car to come into the first training session because he was too nervous and anxious about it. But his friend brought him in, and they're sitting in my lecture theatre, and it's my first night as coach. And so, a lot of this story comes out later, but Joe's sitting in the room and I just remember him. He just kept staring at me and nodding at me with everything I was saying. And I was doing my first presentation to this group around the expectations and where we're going to go. And my beliefs. And I just couldn't stop looking at this kid who was looking at me nodding. Anyway, so his mate wasn't quite up to it, but I'll always be appreciative that his mate brought him along. And we're 8 weeks into a program, and one of Joe's closest friends suicided,
Wow.
which was really sad for the kid. And so he went missing, and he wasn't coming to train. And I thought, how do we find out how he's going? And I ended up getting hold of him, and I said, can we catch up in Vic Park? So we went to the Dome. I'll never forget it. And we caught up, and I bought him breakfast, and we sat, and we're just talking. I was saying, how you going? And he was really upset. I said, look, we really want you to come back. We think you've got a really big future at our footy club. And he goes, I'll come back. I just need to mourn at the moment. I need to do what I'm doing. And as we're sitting there, one of the West Perth coaches, Dion Flay, was walking down the road on the other side. So we're near a company called Monadelphous, and Dion works for Monadelphous. And Joey gets up and out of his seat, basically jumps over the fence almost of where we were at, and starts yelling out, Dizzy, 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 over here. And so Dion goes, and comes over and sits with us for another hour, and we're just talking. And so Joe made me a promise that he'd be back in a week. He said, I need another week and I'll come back in a week. So he came back. Now, in 4 or 5 weeks' time, a similar thing happened, right? So we're really worried about him again. This is the start to his waffle career. And he goes, don't worry, this club's looking after me. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere this time. So the difference in not knowing how safe he was to feeling safe to all of a sudden, no, I need to be here because this place is supporting me. Now, we picked him to play his debut game that year, and his mum passed away in the week that it was going to be his first game. And on the Friday, this is the year the kids had, on the Friday, we go to a church in Guildford, but everyone at the footy club goes and we all wear red and blue jackets. So you'd imagine outside this church, really proud, big Aboriginal family. We all stand outside the church. And as he comes out, we line up and everyone hugs Joe. Right. So this is what I'm talking about, what great footy clubs do. And so the next day, his family comes in and he makes a speech and introduces his family. As you can imagine, are all really emotional. And there's about 7 or 8 out the front. Joe introduces them. His speech was amazing. He goes out and plays his first game. He's one of our better players. And so you just go, this is what good footy clubs do, but this is what a person is able to do to be the best version of himself in it because it's safe and supportive. So then he goes and plays. 4 weeks later, he's struggling a little bit with the contest and the physicality of the game. So I have to tell him that he's not going to be played this week. And I said, we're going to, you're going to be dropped this week. And these are the reasons why. And he stood up, and there was 4 of us in the room, coaches, and he shook all of our hands and he said, I just want to thank you for the opportunity, etc. He walked out of the room and a few of his mates said, you're hardly done by. He said, no, I'm not. I need to become harder at the footy. And he managed that situation and stopped the talking about the soft ear. And he could have gone, I'm hardly done by. Took responsibility. We picked him to play in a grand final in his 4th game. He kicked 2 goals. He got Simpson medal votes, and he had a tackle right at the end of the game that helps us win the grand final.
Wow.
So when you talk about what a great footy club does, that's his first year. Now he's a leader at the club. He's got a teaching job. He's finished his teaching degree. He does clinics with young people. He's just a great human being. But his mate brings him to the footy club, and because he's such a good mate, makes him come inside. But then that environment supports him to be the best he can be. So, like it's one of the stories for me is like you're proud of your footy club when that is the story.
Absolutely. God, so it reminds me of Marley and Pickett and his first game at Richmond, and And also, there was a beautiful Kevin Costner movie called McFarlane USA. I don't know whether you ever saw that.
Yeah.
If you're a sportsman, you'll love it. It's a true story. I won't tell you anymore, but McFarlane USA. It's
Yeah.
just an extraordinary movie, a typical Kevin Costner film,
Yeah.
But I'm interested in your comments. I was the after or lunch speaker several weeks ago at Echuca Footy Club. They had an event on a Friday, and I drove up there and did a talk for them over lunch, and it was really beautiful. And the club really intrigued me what they're doing there because Andrew Walker is the senior coach, former Carlton footballer.
I worked a lot with walks.
Yeah, and he's in the business now with Anthony Rock and a couple other people. I think Juddy might even be in that business, and they're doing Manpower, and I've been helping him, create a few connections in WA. And anyway, the way the club's run, well, first thing he did when he came into the town, he said, "We're not going to go looking recruiting high-priced players from elsewhere. We're going to find our talent in this town. It's a big enough town." That's the first thing he did. And the second thing he did is all of the senior players have got a coaching position in all the junior clubs.
Yeah, brilliant.
And the whole club is on top of the table in all the divisions,
Yeah.
I just thought that's so inclusive and it's so community and it's so getting everybody to do the work that's required to make everything work.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that's your strategy or whether you've seen that before, but I really love that.
Yeah, I think I coached when I was at the Golden Square Footy Club when I went to uni. I coached their under-16s team. And so we only had 16 players. I had to drive to a fish and chip shop to pick up these two Greek boys and drive them to training. And they couldn't play the game, but we wouldn't have had 18 without these two Greek boys who end up becoming a bit of the folklore of that team. But we had a draw. That was our only success for the year. We lost every game and we had a draw.
Right.
And the boys had this party the night they had a draw. Like it was like the greatest thing ever. But how good that was for me, because it wasn't about winning. It was about how do I help these young men to feel
Yeah,
really good about themselves. And so I've got no doubt that that made me a better player and footballer by being a 20-year-old coach.
yeah,
Yeah. So the method in his madness is a good one, because I'll often say every time you teach, so in your footy teams, you're trying to get your leaders and your players to help someone else, because every time you help someone else, you actually help yourself.
yeah,
It's the feeling
absolutely.
you get out of it, but the actual teaching makes you more aware of why you do what you do. And
Yeah,
so it's a big part of the programs for me is how do we get this peer-to-peer coaching and teaching and support, because it actually makes you better.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's so true. I mean, that's part of what I've been teaching in the workplaces. When you practice kindness and encouragement and acknowledgement,
Yeah.
you're uplifting another person, but you also walk away from that liking yourself.
Feel great, don't you?
And that's a great antidote for mental
Yeah.
health challenges.
Yeah.
Just on that note of what you were saying there, I was having a conversation with Paul Roos about it. I just lost my train of thought a little bit. Hang on a sec.
That's all
Um, so we were just talking about um,
right. Teaching.
teaching, and there was something that Roosy said. Oh, yeah. So during the pandemic, we I helped out one of my mates who was the sort of conditioning coach, the physiologist for the emerging Matildas.
Yeah.
And because it was lockdown, they couldn't do much. So he said, "Would you run a session for them on resilience and self-development over Zoom?" And I said, "Sure, let's do that." And so we did a session, and it was so good. Like, the girls were amazing. And he rang me the next day and he said, "Oh man, that was amazing. It was so good. It was great." I said, we need to do another one. I'm not finished yet. So we did another one, and that went really well too, you know. And then I said, I rang him up and I said, we're going to do another one. He said, really? More content? I said, no, I want to get Ruzi on there. And so Ruzi he loved it. So I got him on there and I interviewed him. I asked him a lot of questions, and all the girls are sitting there listening. And we opened up to the girls to ask questions. And one of the girls asked him a question, and he said to her, that is the best question I've ever been asked. And her question was, do you think you would have been a better player or coach if you had coached first before you became an elite player?
Yeah.
And he was so honest. And he said, you know, sometimes when I was playing, my coaches wanted me to do things and I didn't understand. I couldn't fully understand what they were asking of me.
Mm.
And he said, when I became a coach, I got it. You know, he said,
Yeah.
so if I had had an opportunity to coach when I was younger, he said, I think that would have made me a better player, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, along those lines, I think when players have injury or can't play, and you'll often see a leader or a player that's got a long-term injury sitting in a coach's box.
Yeah.
They're just unbelievable opportunities to get a whole different perspective on the game. And
Yeah.
so, you know, one of the things I did as a young player when I first got to WA, we won the Wooden Spoon in '92, but there was a
Wow.
group of us that ended up playing in our next premiership side that went and they used to play double headers at Subiaco Oval, and we went and watched the whole final series.
Wow.
And it just made you realise that that's the level we want to get to. Because when you're
Mm.
sitting watching something, it always looks, for me, it always looks a lot better and harder than it actually is when you're out there. It looks
Yeah.
like it's a whole nother level. So what it does is it gives you this whole purpose for what you do in your training. So it's the same concept as the
Yeah.
coaching point of view, is that by watching and learning and seeing things, you go, geez, I've got some work to do. If it
Yeah.
makes you do the work, you get the result.
Yeah. That's so true, isn't it? Man, it's amazing. I mean, we could talk for hours and hours, I reckon, about this subject. And, you know, because I do feel that, you know, that Australia's a little bit unique in its footy because there's this incredible love of footy, but also like in America, if somebody plays American football at school and they make it to play at college and they make it into pros, that's great. But if they don't make it at those levels, there's nowhere else to go. They
Mm.
can't play. There's no park footy. Whereas here in Australia, it's ridiculous the amount of footy, you know.
Yeah,
And soccer's a little bit the same, but footy seems to have more socialisation around it.
yeah,
And it's so incredible that, you know, it waned for a while and some country clubs started to drop off, but I can feel that it can come back, and if we keep doing this work and building it up,
mm,
because I think at the end of the day, the product is a lot of young men who come through and they learn skills of resilience and cooperation, learn how to be good losers as well as good winners, and, you know, become better human beings, which is ultimately the end of it. So
yeah,
I've got to really acknowledge you for the work that you do and the work that you've done. I'm sure that you've touched many, many lives. And I have a final question for you.
yeah.
So as you're going through the system, and maybe you've mentioned it already, I ask you to contemplate who is a person, a man, a woman, who you looked to and you went, wow, that's who I want to be. That person has given me, there's something in that. That's something to aim for.
There's a lot of them, but the one who really shifted the dial on me was a man by the name of John Dimmer. He was a
Mm-hmm.
school teacher. He coached West Perth to the '95 premiership.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he coached 4 waffle premierships. He's coached amateur premierships here, and just a great human being. But he turned up after Geesh, and so Geesh had built this really strong culture and mateship and standards, and really changed the footy club. Um, he was brilliant for where the footy club is now. But John Dimmer came in and he just was modern day. Like when I say modern day, the things that we look at coaches are doing these days, he was doing. So you'd imagine me, 94, come off the back of losing a prelim, starting to play some good footy, upset Geesh is going, and this new coach comes in and he gets us around to his house really early on. And he sits down and he shows us these soccer games. And he goes, look at this soccer, look at this, the way they're playing here. This is what we're going to get. And we're sort of looking at each other going, this bloke mad? Like, and he was so softly spoken. But then he had these training drills that backed up what he was talking about. And he pulled out vision of us doing exactly what was in the. So he'd gone back and cut some vision of us playing, doing the run and carry and the draw and getting one out, etc. Then we just trained it over and over and over. But what he did was we had a camp and the players had to vote for the captain. But it was like an open vote. And then he came to me and he said, they voted you the captain. So I'm trying to still build my self-esteem and belief in myself. He comes and announces me as the captain because the players have voted me. So I go, my actual peers believe in me. So you'd imagine what that did to me and my purpose. So all of a sudden I'm feeling this responsibility, but he built the responsibility. I'd get to training and he'd go, oh, Darren, Harrow, you've got training tonight. I go, what? So it'd be like a Tuesday night and all of a sudden I'm taking training. And I'm going, okay, so then when players aren't sort of doing the right thing or the voice isn't up, I'm feeling responsible. And then he'd come in and he'd go, oh, we've got a game. Here's the team on the board. He did this before the grand final as well. Oh, I don't know about these three players. Which one would you pick? I go, oh, I'd probably have those. And he'd take the Magnus. He goes, yeah, no worries. That's what we'll do. And so all of a sudden, you'd imagine how this responsibility I'm feeling. So all of a sudden, I was doing things like every player had to have one beer with the opposition after a game. If you couldn't go to that, you had to let me know. All of these little things, our post training. But what he did was he taught me empowerment. He talked about you players own it. He never raised his voice. He never yelled at us. He was always calm. And it took us 12 months to realize, 12 weeks to realise it. But once we realised we were the ones who were leading the footy club and running the footy club because of his leadership, we went on and won a flag. We won by 56 points in a grand final in his first year on the back of his empowerment. So there was some unbelievable lessons there. But I always look back to him and go, he changed the way I thought about things with regards to empowerment and set me on a path that enabled me to be a 3-time premiership coach on the back of what he taught me and to have this success. So I'm probably parts of what I do in my business now is linked to that man. So it's a great question, and I am so grateful of a lot of people in my life, but John Dimmer's the one that came to mind then. John.
Wow, so cool. Well, that's that what you told me about him and about his soccer, it confirms something that I believe really strongly, and that is that Terry Wallace is the one who changed footy more than anybody ever. And it wasn't because of his playing or his coaching. It was because in 1987, when he was moved across from Hawthorn to Richmond, when Alan Bond was the president of Richmond, they gave him a job selling Sky Channel. And he was going around selling dishes to all the VFL players. So they're all sitting at home watching English Premier League soccer. So there was a generation of footballers coming through the mid-'80s there who got obsessed with soccer, and it impacted their coaching.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, amazing, huh?
Yeah, it is.
It's called Plough's Legacy. So, yeah, amazing. Very good, mate. Well, thank you very much, Darren. I'll let you know when I'm coming across to Perth next, and we'll make sure we catch up and have a cup of coffee, mate. It'd be lovely to meet you in person.
Yeah, thanks for sharing too, John.
Yeah, thank you, mate. Really appreciate it. I'll let you know when the podcast is published. And For all of you out there, thank you for tuning in to the Good Bloke Not Woke podcast. And remember, try to be the adult that you needed when you were a little kid and you were frightened or you felt lost. Okay, take care.